Boom, here we are. Once again, live for another Whiskey Me tasting. This week, this month, Old Pulteney Huddart. And guess what? Guess who's got a whole bottle of this stuff this time? That's right. We joined again by Stuart Baxter. If you remember last month, he had a whole bottle of Balblair 15, which I was very jealous of. So I've made sure I have an entire bottle of whiskey. I say entire, as you can see, I've been enjoying it already. That's not all tonight, I should say. So I have a whole bottle. I bet Stuart's got a whole bottle. Our returning guest. Let's see. Hey, Stuart, you're right.
I'm very good.
Oh, wow. Look, the wash line's virtually the same. Isn't that cool?
Not bad. Same alcohol problem. That's good.
I've got a pouch as well. So if I was to pour that in, then yeah, we'd be about the same.
Yeah, I don't think this is quite 60 ml.
Oh, well, look, thanks again for coming back on. You are saying before we went live, the first, I think you're the first ever returning guest, but certainly the first person to do 2 months in a row besides me. So it must have gone all right last time. I don't know.
Well, I mean, you asked me back, but I don't think you knew that I also represent Old Pulteney, so I think I slipped through the cracks in that one. But yeah, no, I'm happy to be back.
Yeah, well, actually, it's a good starting point, actually. So Old Pulteney and Balblair owned by the same company, right?
Yeah, so it's into Inverhouse Distillers, so run by Inverhouse Distillers. So we also have Anok, Caroon, Speyburn are part of our portfolio as well.
Nice, good. So let's talk a little bit about Old Pulteney. I mean, I said last month that the northeast coast is sort of one of my favourite regions for distilleries. Old Pulteney is not one I've visited, actually. It's just that little bit too far north. But it is a real favourite of mine. I think because it's a great example of a whiskey that speaks of place, and I really like that in the distillery where it's sort of immediately identifiable. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about the distillery and the town.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's that little bit extra north. I mean, you hit Inverness and you're only halfway, really. So I think it's like 20 minutes south of John O'Groats. We're the second most northern mainland distillery. Wolfburn, lovely whiskey, fairly recently took us over as Whisky goes. But Wick, I mean, it's an amazing place. I mean, Wick didn't, until the early 1900s, didn't have a road that connected it. So everything came through boats, right? It was some fishing village. That's where it came from, was herring fishing. And when you talk about that sense of place, it's quite wonderful at how it works. But all casks that go into Old Pulteney single malt are aged at the distillery. So we have casks that are aged out in Airdrie in our cask warehousing. I think I maybe talked about with Balblair. But those casks will go into blending. They'll go into single cask or independent bottlers, for that example. But the wonderful thing is that, casks breathe. That's how we know the angel share is working. So I say warmth in Scotland, especially northeast Scotland, the warmth or the warmer seasons, it'll expand and suck in that whiskey or that new make, and then in the colder months it'll spit it back out. But as it's doing that, it's also taking from the external, so it's taking in that coastal air and bringing it in. And Pulteney is one of the best examples of place where it truly is terroir affecting the final spirit. And of course, it's not like peat where we're aging that out. We're actually seeing that almost intensify. But it's that constant battle between, depending what oak you're putting it in, what that cask has been seasoned with, you're constantly going to be having that fight.
Yeah, well, so let's talk a little bit about, it's a coastal whiskey, obviously. It even says on the bottle, what is it, Maritime whiskey, the Maritime malt, yeah. So heavy emphasis on that. And it's undeniable, perhaps not so much in Huddart because of that peated element, which we'll get onto, but it's certainly in other expressions of Pulteney that I've tasted. It seems to be not just a sort of romantic influence, but there seems to be a certain like salty, salinity, seaweedy, oceanic, maritime kind of element to it. So where do we attribute that to? Like, is it this sea air being breathed into the barrels, as you say? Is that what it is?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting. I'm sure there'll be a few people on here that'll know this, but I'm an absolute whiskey geek. I love this kind of stuff. But it's been proven that salt crystals can't pass or permeate casks. They can't permeate the oak. But the interesting conversation I had with Stuart Harvey, who's our master blender for Inverhouse Distillers, he's an absolute wonderful guy. The interesting thing is I always kind of push away from salinity as much as I do use that because it's a very understandable phrase, right? But as human beings, we don't perceive maritime as just salt. It's not, it's not,
no.
As soon as we have salt in our dinner, we don't assume that's maritime, right? That's not what you need it to be.
I'm just putting a kind of like maritime influence on my steak here.
Exactly. So there's other elements, there's other minerals that come into play that when we walk on a beach, because I think I think obviously when we talk about Huddart with the peated element, it's maybe not as prevalent as we see it with 12, with 15, even into 18. But when we nose it, there is this maritime walking on a beach saltiness. But I wouldn't say it's salt, and it's it's been proven it's technically not. But there is, I think it's undeniable to say that there is a maritime element to it. And we've taken casks that are 12, 15, 18 years old that we have in store at Airdrie, and those casks that we've had aged for the same amount of time up in Wick, and they taste complete. Profile's obviously the same, but there's this other attached element that is, I mean, we can technically say it's inexplicable. You can't actually prove what's happening, but there is, and we can say that it is the coast, and it's that coastal dunnage warehousing that's affecting it and breathing in that coastal air.
Yeah, I mean, to your point about it being more than just salt or salinity, I mean, when you walk on the beach and you breathe in that smell of whatever it is you're breathing in, not just salt. Salt being a sort of taste sensation, that's the one thing you're not smelling. You can't smell saltiness. You're smelling other things you associate with saltiness because they're by the sea. So, whether that's seaweed or some sort of, other organic matter associated with the sea, or, the things that other things that live in the ocean, the sort of decay of those things that's taking place constantly on the sand or on the shingle. Whatever the other wildlife that might be around, or the grass growing and everything, all of those things contribute that kind of maritime characteristic. Or even like, the smell of like a wet wood on the deck of a boat, all these kind of characteristics contribute. So it's just sort of fascinating, I think, that we can, in the same way that we can breathe in those smells, a cask of whiskey perhaps can also, absorb some of those characteristics straight out of the air and impart them into the whiskey. Herring would be another example as well, of course, with Wick's history of herring fishing.
Yeah, exactly that. And there's that lovely marketing speech, but it does work. It's Wick was famous for exporting and importing casks of silver and gold, silver being herring and gold being the whiskey. It's absolutely love that.
Yeah, that is cool, isn't it? It was the busiest herring fishing port in the world at one point, I understand.
Yeah, it was. I mean, you had fishermen coming over from the Nordic countries as well. It was quite intense. It was over like 1,000, 1,200 boats at one time that were all just fishing out of Wick. And of course, there's no road that's connecting it during these times. And the wonderful thing is I don't know if many people know, but Wick and the Council of Wick had 25 years of prohibition. That ran well into World War II, and not many people know it. But I know that there's other surrounding areas that have had levels of prohibition. But when you've got a very isolated area of the world that has a distillery, and a lot of wealthy young men and women, because they've got nowhere to spend it, they're making all this money, but they've got nowhere to spend it. I can't imagine that prohibition was strictly followed.
No,
I can't imagine that it was strictly followed.
Yeah, I can't imagine that either. And especially with like seafaring men and women, coming into port after a tough few days fishing, you've got really nowhere to go besides the town. You're going to want to be having a drink. And then there's this distillery, which presumably was it out of action during the Prohibition period, or were they still exporting it elsewhere?
For a while, it was still in action. It fell silent. I'm going to correct this. 1931, 1932. But it was still active. It was still exporting liquid, because it was Prohibition in terms of consumption, but in production was still able to operate.
Could still make it. Yeah. And I understand that because of the population being more or less entirely dominated by people working on boats or in the fishing industry, the people who worked at the distillery at that time tended to be sort of part-time fishermen as well, or at least in some way involved in the industry, and then sort of doing the distilling stuff on the side, or cask management, or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean the whole history with distilling is normally associated with farmers, right? And it's you still to this day you have that kind of age-old honoured time off during harvesting season, right? That's still a thing that's done. But as you say, during the distilling, during Wick, I mean there probably were a number of farmers in Wick at the time, but you would argue the majority of the populace were fishermen, and that would have probably been the same case for the distillers as well. I mean, you're not going to go for the most lucrative. It was the most lucrative profession at that period of time in that area. That was the whole point. So you would argue that would have been, I mean, completely speculation, but maybe 80% of the distillers as well would probably have been fishermen as opposed to farmers, which was the off season for that.
Yeah, sure, makes sense. Right, so let's talk a little bit about Huddart, which I believe is named after the street on which this distillery resides. So it's non-age statement, and it's got the twist here is the maturation, right? It's quite unusual for Old Pulteney. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is 46% non-chill, no caramel colouring. So non-chill filtered, meaning all the fatty acids and proteins come from the cask into the whiskey. I think I might have talked this with Balblair as well. And no caramel colouring, so it's natural colour.
Is that true for all Old Pulteney malts? Everything?
Not the 12, but Huddart upwards, all true for that. But the 12 is, we always talk about our accessible whiskey. So that's at 40% ABV. So much lower, a bit more of an accessible one as well. So this is non-chill, no caramel colouring, 46, 100%. So even in the finishing, it's 100% ex-American oak, ex-bourbon casks. But then we finish in ex-peated casks. So this is not peated whiskey. It's not been peated at the new mixed spirit stage. This was introduced, or this aged spirit was then introduced to casks that previously held peated whiskey. And the one thing to note, and I think it's an important note, is the peated whiskey that was originally in those casks was not coastal Islay peat or originating from that. It was mainland peat. Now, a lot of people don't know that there's different types of peat, because peat itself is just semi-fossilized plant material that's been compressed underneath the earth. So when you take it from the coast, you're taking seaweed, kelp, that salty, briny, that's where we get that lovely medicinal iodine kind of flavor with Islay whiskies. But what we're taking this from is actually ex-Annock peated casks. And we're taking the peat that we're using there is actually mainland peat. So it's going to be, trees, heather, floral, herbal. So it's more of a forest fire peat, that kind of campfire peat than that coastal one. So that's what we're going to see. So we're actually finishing this in. And again, the non-age statement thing, a lot of people are quite averse to it. But the really important thing to notice, and I think I might have talked to this Balblair as well, is that line of age. Certain things, as we age things, it doesn't mean that this all of a sudden everything increases and becomes better. That's nonsense. The idea is that when we increase, some things will decrease, some things will increase, some things will hit an optimum point along that age line. And the only person that can dictate whether they enjoy a specific point in that age is the individual that's drinking it. No one else can dictate that. But of course, at 3 years old, I'm sure a lot of people have tasted 3-year-old whiskies that's genuinely stunning and really unique flavors. So when we have a non-age statement, we're not handcuffed waiting for 12 years to be the minimum cask going in there, waiting for 15 years. So a non-age statement allows you to utilize the full line, there's that old anecdote, the painting different malts produce different flavors. It's that the different paint palette that you have at 3 years all the way up, using all those different ones to create something that's greater than some of its parts, all those casks. But the average age on this, because I know a lot of people are probably going to ask, is about 9 years old, 9 to 10 years old. It's the average age on it.
Yeah, like you say, it's the analogy you often hear with blending whiskey, whether it's blended whiskey or in-house blending in malts, is like orchestra. So you've got your kind of like percussion, your deeper kind of notes. You've got your middle bit, which is, I don't know, is that brass or woodwind, and then you've got your sort of strings right at the top there. And if you think about kind of maturing whiskies along that same line, the analogy is not perfect, but you've got those sort of bright, youthful, zippy kind of whiskies that at age 3 to 6 years old, let's say, and then you've got your deep, bassy, heavily wood influenced whiskies right up there, sort of 15 or 20 years old, or 25 years old, or whatever. You mix them all together and you get something that's a bit more interesting than just that one dimension on its own. Don't get me wrong, like a guitar solo sounds good as well. But it's nice to hear a piece of orchestral music, right?
No, and that's it. And I think the anecdote still works when you transfer it into single malt, because single malt is blended, right? It's just as long as it's single distillery and malted barley, you're still able to blend multiple casks together from one distillery. So I still think that anecdote works with regards to that. And it's, young casks versus old casks from the same distillery are going to give you completely different characters. And I might have gone in Balblair and talked about how one cask is a family member, but, Balblair or Pulteney, that's the new mixed spirit, that's the bloodline. But as soon as you put that bloodline into port cask or sherry cask, you're seeing a different character to that specific family.
Yeah, or I like the family analogy. That's good. So you could say that, you're sort of mixing up the gene pool, potentially muddying the bloodline, or indeed perfecting it to create the ultimate
Yeah.
genetic specimen.
I always think about like a family party, if that one uncle comes and it's like, oh no, and the whole party just dies. That still happens with blending, right? So if that uncle
Yeah,
doesn't come,
that's the
everyone's
dud
having a really good
cask
time.
in the dunnage, right? The dud cask. Like, damn it, we put whiskey in this crappy cask, and now look what it tastes like.
Yeah.
So the peat component of it is interesting. And I find it fascinating that we're tasting a whiskey here that has a noticeable smoky characteristic to it. And yet that smoke was created on a fire that was burnt, who knows, 15, 20, 40 years ago to dry some barley, which was then mashed and fermented and then distilled a couple of times. And then it was put into a barrel. Then it was taken back out of that barrel. But that barrel, when taken over to Old Pulteney, still has some of the residue
Yeah.
of that fire that was burnt decades ago. That shows us how pervasive phenols and peat and smoke are in whiskey, right? When they carry through like that.
Yeah, 100%. And the one thing I think this benefits from, if anyone's having a sip along, the one thing I really think this benefits from, have a nose and a sip on it, but I think it really benefits from a little bit of water. I've always argued that, water for me, this is very subjective, right? So this isn't truth, this isn't like gospel. For me, I always find adding a little bit of water to Islay whiskies kind of calm them down a bit, but with peated cask finishes, because Scapa Glanza also do a peated cask finish, and I found it with that as well. Is adding a little bit of water opens it up a bit more. The smokiness comes a bit more prevalent. Also, that at the end of the day, this is a 9-year-old Pulteney, roughly. Again, that's complete average age, roughly. That's speculation. You're going to see those esters, those aldehydes come through. I think it benefits from a little bit of water.
Yeah, I think it's true of most whiskies in a way, and even if it doesn't necessarily taste better, it's just an interesting way of exploring that whiskey and seeing it from a different perspective. The casks themselves, then, so it's annock casks, like you say, mainland peat, which has less of that sort of maritime influence on account of the particular vegetation that the peat is composed of.
Yeah.
It makes sense to take those casks because Inverhouse own that distillery, and so good access. But wasn't there a temptation there, do you think, to sort of say, well, let's get the most, coastal peat influenced barrels we can get our hands on because we want to amplify that coastal characteristic we've already got in the whiskey? Or is it more a case of like, well, let's just see what happens when we contrast that with more earthy, kind of traditionally earthy characteristics of a mainland peat whiskey?
I think the objective was, like, I think mainland peat is quite underrepresented. Represented? How many T's and D's are in that? Within the whiskey industry, right? But the whole idea behind this wasn't to dominate the flavour of Pulteney. It was still to have that maritime concept come through in it. Those fruity esters come through in it. And the whole idea is not to create a peaty whiskey. That's not the objective here. The objective is to give you that aroma, that very delicate aroma, that backing of smoke. And of course, when you look at the contrast between those two different peats, Islay coastal peat is a lot more dominating than mainland peat, purely because of the nature of where it comes from, right? The whole objective with this was to create a unique, creative Pulteney that we can stand by as quality liquid, but give you that aroma, that wisp of peat smoke that is not in any way the most dominant character, I think, in Pulteney Huddart.
No, I think it's a really nice balance. We'll get out some tasting notes in a second, but it's my kind of peaty whiskey. Sometimes I really like heavily peated coastal whiskey, because sometimes you want something a bit bracing and full on like that, just to kind of make you go, wow. But a lot of the time when I drink peated whiskey, I want the peat to be present but not dominant. And that's why I've always liked distilleries like Talisker and Highland Park, where there's a sort of peaty component to it, but it's not the sort of overriding force of the whole thing. This is a great balance, I think. It's gently sort of smoky on the nose, it's certainly there, but then there's something underneath that. And, what you end up with is, unsurprisingly, it's sort of like beach bonfire, it's that kind of combination of the two characteristics, hot jingle,
Yeah, and I think towards the back, for me, is that kind of pepperiness. It's like a white or black pepper towards the back. It's not quite intense smoke for me. It's that slight peppery spiciness, like rye bread spiciness. But the interesting thing is, like, we can get quite caught up in that because I think that's quite a dominating factor of this whiskey. But if you really just take your time and focus on the tip of your tongue, the front of it, I think there's still a very fruity, ester-filled character to this whiskey. I mean, the one thing I always talk about is if you're salivating, then it's sweet, it's juicy, right? There's something to that that's producing that, it's subconsciously producing that. And for me, it is. There's a, you know, like almost like a bonfired pineapple where it's been bonfired to such a point where you almost don't taste that immediate sharp sugary sweetness. But I think there's elements to it there.
I like this. We're honing in on this very increasingly complex analogy or metaphor. So it's now overly barbecued pineapple on a beach, bonfire stroke barbecue. But you're right. One of my strategies for sort of detecting fruitiness, which I do quite a lot. Well, first of all, adding water and smelling is always good, and that does bring out a slight tropical note to this. But one of the things I like to do is take a sip of the whiskey, swallow it, and then with your mouth then empty, just kind of move the air around your mouth with your lips closed, and that sort of cycles that aroma back out retronasally through your nose. And that, for me anyway, it's with a dry mouth where I really start to get some of those sort of tropical esters come through.
Yeah, the one thing, and I guess it's a you know, tune to that, is the next morning after doing a tasting or a whiskey tasting, when the glasses are empty next to the sink, you know, whiskey does oxidize like wine. It does happen. It just takes a much longer period. But the next mornings, when you smell those whiskeys again, they're much sweeter. It's much more fruit forward.
I think we talked about this last time actually, and suggested that you go and minesweep your own kitchen in the next morning.
Yeah, thankfully I've not had a tasting in a week or so. So yeah, it's pretty empty just now, unfortunately.
Right, let's get up some tasting notes here. Nose of wet grass or leaves after the rain. Well, that's such an evocative kind of smell, isn't it? That whole, you know, weather changing aroma of the outdoors. Yeah. What else have we got here? Getting rainy day. I mean, it is a rainy day. Perhaps you've got the window open. Earthy we're getting, which I think is probably that mainland peat coming through. I mean, leaves and earthy and all this kind of stuff, that's really interesting, isn't it? And I'm sure, as you say, you wouldn't get that if you were using, you know, ex-Lafroy casks, for example.
Yeah, and I think earthy is, I think, a very good way of describing it. It's the crux of it, and it's almost taking that coastal concept inland a little bit more with it.
Yeah. Here we go. Some more delicious, sweet, smoky, and vanilla. Just ordered a bottle.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to hear.
Good. It is really tasty. I think it's pretty good price as well, right? I think it's what, 44, 45 pounds, something like that, a bottle, which is good.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, for an interesting dram like this, you know, some people say, oh, it's not an age statement, blah, 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 but you know, it's delicious, and that's what counts most of all. And there's obviously been a fair bit of thought gone into it, and a very unique Old Pulteney in the sense that it's peat. I'm assuming you'd never make any peated whiskey there, not even for a week or two of a year.
No, we've historically, I'm trying to think of any bottle that we might have, because it's not a massive pain to run a peated run, right? It's not a massive pain in terms of.
A lot of distilleries do this, don't they? They do a couple of weeks a year or a few weeks a year.
Yeah, Anok, we do with Anok. You know, it is done with Anok, so it's not out of the world. I'm just trying to think of anything in the past that we have done that doesn't come to mind immediately. Someone probably will be able to correct me if I can't think of it. But no, we've not got anything on the board just now or in the recent past that we've done anything with, which is there. But it's a shame that you've not been to Pulteney. Do you know the story behind the still, the wash still?
Well, I know it's ugly.
It's oh, come on, no copper still. There's not one.
It's well, no, I mean, it's not that ugly because the bottle shape is based on the still, right? But I would argue that the still is more deformed's a horrible word. Shouldn't say
bulbous.
that.
Bulbous.
Yeah, bulbous than the bottle suggests. But one thing the bottle's got accurate is flat top stills, right?
The wash still, not the spirit stills. The wash still, when it was first installed, the roof wasn't high enough. So if anyone's on, you can Google this right now and see wash still Old Pulteney, and you'll see, as Tristan's saying, is they chopped the top because they couldn't get the swan neck in the original roof. If you go up now, you'll see that the roof is probably high enough, but because you're distilling with that, you need to keep character, right? So they chop the still off and then just attach the line arm on the side, and it's a very kind of, you know, chop and change. This will work thing.
That's why I suggested, that it's sort of slightly disfigured.
But it's great, and it's now so key to the flavor profile of Pulteney, right? Once you're distilling, you need to keep the shape of the stills. So it's funny because now the roof's big enough that it's should we have this one, Nick? Like, no, we can't change that.
When was that wash still loaded in? Do you know how long ago was that?
I mean, it was back in like 1820s, 1830s,
right?
Okay,
so it's that old.
The original.
Presumably some bits have been replaced and repaired, but obviously they've got to keep it the same size, right?
Yeah, so not original still in that sense, but it's the same shape, size, and everything with it. So you have to maintain that, right? Yeah,
exactly. Coastal forest walk. I want a coastal forest. You got to go a long way for one of them, Costa Rica or something like that. But yeah, I get you. It's definitely got that combination of leaves and sea and everything. Yeah. Oh, we're getting a lot of tasting notes through this month. This might be a record for tasting notes. Everyone's got something to say about it, which is definitely a good thing. Lovely oily mossiness when I hold it in the mouth for a bit.
The oiliness I completely agree with is that, and I think that's testament to the ABV and the chill filtration. You know, allowing that fat, non-chill filtration, allowing those fatty acids in, and because it's ex-bourbon, I think you see more of the distillery character in ex-bourbon than you would see ex-sherry. And I'm not saying ex-sherry is bad. I'm just saying I think it's tomatoes. One's not better than the other. But with bourbon, especially with that age, you definitely see more distillery character coming through.
Yeah. Really cool. What's the I mean, maybe not for Huddart, but generally in Pulteney, are there sort of like food serves or anything recommended ways of drinking these sort of very maritime influenced whiskies? Bit of herring, I guess.
Bit of herring and oysters. See like a little dribble of Old Pulteney and an oyster and throwing it down is life changing. I've got an atomizer, so you can fill it with Pulteney, spray it on, and then it's genuinely life changing. And then of course you've got an empty oyster shell, you can pour it in and throw it down. But seafood is obviously the recommended pairing, but it does work quite well.
It's the best way to drink whiskey if you're on the beach, right? Is just walk along with an oyster, delete the oyster, i.e. eat it, and then you've got yourself a disposable drinking vessel that you can drink.
And it keeps you to, that must be what, 30 mil? You know, in an oyster, 25, 30 mil?
Depends on the oyster, doesn't it? I reckon I've had some oysters that could take 50, but yeah.
I've seen some pretty big oysters, that's very true.
Yeah. But it's not the most practical drinking vessel. It's a bit like a martini glass, isn't it? Like really wide at the top.
I refuse to make most of my drinks in a martini glass because I can't walk anywhere with them, right?
I think that was probably part of the reason for the design. Well, actually, martini glasses were based like a Art Deco version of the coupe, of course, the champagne glass, which was allegedly modelled on Marie Antoinette's breasts.
Yeah.
But I think part of the kind of nature of those glasses is that you shouldn't be walking, you should be sitting, right? That's the whole idea. It's supposed to be
I mean, bringing it to my mouth is a challenge in itself. So yeah,
just that sitting 6 inches from the table. Yeah. Oh dear. Right. Cool. Well, look. Can't promise I'm going to have you back again next month, Stuart. Unfortunately, it's a shame though. We're going to need you to start working on other brands if we're going to continue this going because it's fun. You're a good guest. Thank you.
No, I was always enjoying it. It was great fun last week. It was great fun this week. So thank you everyone that joined in as well.
Yeah, cool. Yes, thanks everyone for joining. Keep the contents. God, I shouldn't have had a whole bottle. Oh, Helen is correct. Wait, finally, Crinnonwood in Argyll and Ugewood in Portree, Skye are both coastal forests. Right, I stand corrected. I didn't know there were any of them in Scotland at all, but good knowledge, Helen. Thank you. Right, cool. Thanks, guys. Thank you, everyone. Cheers, Stuart. And if you are doing the World Whiskey Tasting, it is next, let me get this right, Tuesday, the 16th. So we will see you then. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Cheers all.